If you're the type of person that spends so much money on unnecessary things, so much so that you feel like it's become an addiction that you no longer have control over, I'm here to tell you it's not your fault. The reason that you can't control your spending is because we're living in a world that our primitive brains can't function in. And it's so clear to see because we live in the age where everyone is addicted to something, whether that's social media, overeating, or online shopping. It's very hard to have self-control in the world that we're living in. And if you find yourself spending too much money on unnecessary things, if you find yourself addicted to spending money, then this video is for you because in this video, we're going to analyze this addictive world that we live in and how to overcome it to create a better relationship with money. And a lot of what we're going to talk about in this video comes from this book, Dopamine Nation by Anna Lembke. So in order to understand why it's so hard to have self-control in this world, we need to first talk about our past with chapter 1, From Scarcity to Abundance. As I said, if you have trouble with spending too much money, it's probably not your fault. Because although it's important to have self-control and personal responsibility, we're competing against our own human psychology. And let me explain how by giving you a crash course on human history, which begins about 200,000 years ago, when we humans were hunter-gatherers. And this was a time of hardship and scarcity, where our biggest pleasures were sitting around a warm fire, finding food in the story of the hunt. And we lived in that scarce world for about 180,000 years. Until then, about 12,000 years ago, we human beings settled down and discovered farming, which made survival easier and things were less scarce. And we could enjoy easier access to food, more security, and easier work. And with all that extra time, we started to become more advanced, which leads us to today, where we're living in this age of comfort and abundance, where we have online shopping, food delivery apps, and cars. And so the reason that you're having trouble spending too much money is because our brains evolved over the period of 200,000 years to live in a world of hardship and scarcity. But for the last 50 years, we've been living in a world of extreme comfort and abundance. It's hard to have self-control with our spending because our own human psychology is against us. Our brains are saying, seek pleasure, things are scarce. But we live in a time where pleasure is extremely easy to come by, which leads me to chapter 2, the age of easy pleasure. So back in the day when we were chasing the buffalo, before we sold out to the man, pleasure wasn't something that was easy to come by. I mean, we might spend hours walking through the forest, eventually find some berries, and get pleasure from eating those sweet berries. We put in all this effort first to receive this small reward. And this pleasure was good for us because things were scarce and it encouraged us. But nowadays, pleasure is so easy to come by. I mean, we can simply pull out our smartphones, order some sugar-coated berries on Instacart along with a bunch of candy, and get it delivered to your house. We put in no effort to get the reward, and because we human beings love our pleasure, when it's extremely easy to get, we seek it out as much as we can, and we frequently buy things on Amazon, seek convenience through apps, and buy nice possessions. We do these activities that involve buying things and spending money because it makes us feel good. We like to seek this pleasure, but what ends up happening is when we do this too much, it creates this addictive behavior where you buy something to get pleasure. Then you want to recreate that feeling, but you have to buy something bigger. Then you have to buy something bigger. And eventually, you find yourself unable to control your spending, not because you're addicted to stuff, but because you're addicted to the pleasure that comes from spending money. You're addicted to that exciting feeling that comes from spending money. And because we live in this world of abundance, this world of easy pleasure, it's something that's extremely hard to overcome. But to overcome this addiction, we next need to talk about how addictions work with chapter 3, the pain-pleasure seesaw. All right, so now that we established that the reason it's so hard to stop spending money is because your brain evolved for hardship and scarcity, but is living in comfort and abundance. Let's try to understand how this creates an addiction by talking about what the author of Dopamine Nation calls the pain-pleasure seesaw. So let's imagine a seesaw, or as they say in England, a teeter-totter. And on one side of the seesaw is pleasure, and on the other side is pain. This is your natural balance. Now, whenever you do a high dopamine activity like online shopping, you push down on the pleasure side of the seesaw, getting pleasure from buying something and no pain. However, eventually, your brain wants to go back to this balance, so afterwards, you might experience some pain, like boredom or lack of contentment. And once you're back to that balance, you want to experience that feeling of pleasure again, but this time you need a bigger hit, so you have to spend more money, which again increases the pleasure side, but afterwards you experience some pain to balance it out. And eventually, as you keep doing this, instead of returning to a neutral balance, your default balance is pain. And instead of feeling neutral when you're not spending money, you feel bad. And so you start to spend more and more money to both get pleasure and combat pain. And so if you're having trouble spending too much money, it might be because for so long you've been seeking pleasure from the behavior of spending money that you've created this imbalance with your pain and pleasure. And the only way to break this addiction is get back to that equilibrium. So let's talk about how we do that and how we can break this addiction with Chapter 4, Returning to Equilibrium. Now, I am not a psychiatrist, but if you're having trouble with spending too much money to the point that you do not feel like you have control over it, chances are it's because your pain-pleasure seesaw is imbalanced. Your own brain chemistry is being manipulated by this abundant world that we live in. And the only way to overcome this addiction and control your spending is to move back to equilibrium. And in the book, the author offers two solutions on how to do this. The first solution is abstain from pleasure for 2 to 4 weeks. If you constantly feel the urge to spend money to get pleasure or just to avoid pain, instead of constantly trying to push down on the pleasure side, simply don't seek pleasure. And this is something that requires a lot of self-discipline to do. But for 2 to 4 weeks, avoid indulging in spending money, distance yourself from online shopping, and avoid impulse purchases. And over time, your brain will recalibrate and move back to equilibrium, making you not feel the urge to spend money to get rid of that pain. And your tolerance for pleasure won't be extremely high. And the second solution is intentionally press on the pain side of the seesaw. As we've seen, pleasure is always followed by pain. On the other hand, pain is followed by pleasure. So instead of constantly seeking pleasurable activities like spending money, seek some painful activities like taking a cold shower or exercising because it will move your brain back to equilibrium. The goal is to have this neutral balance where you don't get trapped in this negative feedback loop that's telling you to spend more and more money to get pleasure and avoid pain. And when you get back to this equilibrium, you're able to think more rationally and make better decisions. And that's how you resist the urge to stop spending money. But it's much easier said than done. So let's talk about some of the obstacles that you'll face when trying to overcome this with Chapter 5, Overcoming Emotional Obstacles. In order to beat this addiction with spending money, there are 4 obstacles that you might encounter. So let's talk about those 4 obstacles and how to overcome them. The first obstacle is prioritizing long-term rewards. So the first obstacle that you might face when overcoming this addiction to spending is focusing on long-term rewards. Because when you're spending money, you're often focusing on short-term rewards. You're just getting that quick dopamine hit. But if you sit down and take the time to write down some of your long-term goals, like having more financial security, more financial freedom, and no debt, then it helps to motivate you to change your behavior and see the cons of always seeking these short-term goals. Now, the second obstacle is recognizing and accepting your behavior patterns. It's very easy to recognize and point out someone else's behavior patterns, but it's very hard to recognize and accept your own behavior patterns, especially when they're bad. And when you have this spending addiction, you might ignore, minimize, or discount your patterns of behavior. You just sweep it under the rug. However, if you do the uncomfortable act of being honest with yourself, then you can recognize your bad habits, strengthen your mind, hold yourself accountable, and see you have the power to change it. Being honest with yourself can open the door to actual change. Now, the third obstacle is isolation. In the United States, the Surgeon General has declared an epidemic on isolation and loneliness. And when people feel lonely and isolated, they turn to these addictive behaviors like spending money because they think that it brings them pleasure. However, it doesn't work. It just intensifies the problem. And instead, we should discuss our addictive behaviors with others and find a supportive community. We humans need each other, and the pleasure that we get from being around each other is much more sustainable than the pleasure of spending money. And the final obstacle is escapism. A huge reason that people have these addictive spending habits is because we live in a very mundane world where not that much goes on, and people view it as a way to escape the mundane world. But this escapism brings a lot of pain into our lives, and instead we should search to find hobbies and passions that make life more interesting. And if you can overcome these obstacles and move back to equilibrium, then you could stop spending too much money on unnecessary things. Many people have trouble with spending money because our brains evolved in a time for hardship and scarcity, and now we're living in times of comfort and abundance. And if you can recognize that the reason that you're having trouble with spending too much money is because your pain-pleasure seesaw is imbalanced and focus on moving it back to equilibrium, then you can have a much healthier relationship with money. And that's how you stop spending money on unnecessary things. I hope this video helped. If you want to dive a little bit deeper in this topic, I recommend you read Dopamine Nation by Anna Limbuk, or however you pronounce that last name. And with that, muchas gracias. Que tengan un buen día. Nos vemos, chicos.